Hello and welcome to Myths in the Meadow with me, Marcus Pibworth. And welcome to Rock Meadow on this beautiful sunny day in the west of Herefordshire with the Black Mountains in the background. There's swifts and swallows flying over above. I can see a red kite circling over an oak there. It's a really beautiful day. I'm using nature. I've got the tripod stuck into a molehill. So I finally found a good use for molehills. And as I'm recording this, it's only a few days away from the summer solstice. So I thought I'd bring you a nice solstice seasonal story. And that one is the story of the Oak King and the Holly King. Now the Oak King and the Holly King, they were supposed to be ruling the kingdom together. And they were brothers. But truth be told, they hated each other. They both had completely different ideas of how one should rule. Now the Oak King, he loved it like this. He loved a lovely sunny day. He loved the sun to be hanging high in the sky, shining its light and its warmth down on everything. He loved the wildflower meadow. He loved to watch the trees full of lovely, luscious green leaves. He believed that fruits and nuts and seeds should be dropping at all times, that everyone should have full bellies. Abundance was his way. He had a great castle that grew from the earth like a gnarled oak, surrounded by beautiful ancient woodland, all in full bloom. This is the way it had to be. This was great. This is the only way. Now his brother, the Holly King, he thought completely differently. He wasn't against the sun, of course he wasn't, but he preferred it when it was just there for an hour or two, lingering just above the horizon, not giving too much warmth. He loved the night, he loved the darkness, and he loved the cold it brought. He didn't want to see a wildflower meadow, he liked to see frozen tundras. Now his palace was a great icy palace in the mountains, and he'd crafted beautiful icicles that hung around it. His palettes were not greens and pinks and yellows. They were blues and greys and silvers. That is what he loved. He wasn't a tyrant. He hadn't outlawed fires. If people didn't want to feel cold all the time, they could light a fire, but that wasn't his way. He loved the cold and he loved the darkness, and he knew that this was the way it had to be. But the problem was that no sooner had he sprinkled his snow on the top of the mountains, and he stood back to watch the glistening in the light, his brother, the Oak King, would come along and shine the sun right down on it and make it melt, and he'd watch in horror as green shoots began to appear where the snow had once been. But equally, the Oak King was furious when he'd completed a wildflower meadow. And before he had had a really good chance to enjoy it, to sit in it, to watch the bees, to look at the different colours, to note the different flowers, his brother would come in and breathe an icy gale across it, and it would wither and die, and the ground would freeze. This is the way it went, on and on and on, backwards and forwards, hot and cold, light and dark, always in a constant, tiring, exhausting battle. Both of them grew to hate each other, detest each other. They moved further and further apart from each other. But still, they knew the other one was wrong. The land could not be icy. No, the land could not be green. And they fought and they fought and they fought and they bickered and they argued. But things couldn't go on this way. And one day the Holly King grew furious. He couldn't take it anymore. The sun again was shining in the sky, and he wasn't going to go down and drag it down again. Oh no, this could not go on. So he went into his ice palace and he got a cold, steely blade, and he marched to the place where the grasses began to grow strong. He stood at the end of the woodland with that oak palace before him, and he said, "Come out here. This cannot go on. You are wrong. My way is how it needs to be. Let's settle this once and for all." The Oak King stood on the battlements of his oak palace. "Get away from here! You know nothing of how to rule a land. Your cold ways cannot prosper. I'll come down there, we will settle this. And I know who will win." And he came out, he grabbed the warm steel of his blade and he walked out of the door and he strode straight up to the clearing where his brother stood. And right there they fought. Now sometimes the clearing was almost covered in ice. Other times the ice forced to recede as the grass began to bloom. And the two brothers fought, hot steel against cold steel. And the clangs of their swords ricocheted across the land. They were quite equally matched, so it went on for days and days, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, perhaps even years. Now sometimes it looked like the Holly King was sure to win, other times it looked like the Oak King was going to win. And then it happened. Now the Oak King faltered. He took a step backwards, and in that brief window of opportunity, his brother, the Holly King, saw what to do. He grabbed his sword and he plunged it deep into his brother. As he pulled it out, the Oak King fell to the ground. He slumped down. As he did, the grass around him withered, and the snow began to fall. As it did, the white of the snow began to turn red. Now the Holly King threw back his head. This is how it had to be. It was the only way. I had to teach you a lesson. Now winter will rule. As he sheathed his sword, he turned and he began to walk back towards his icy palace. And as he did, the ground around it that had grass sprouting out of it began to freeze all around. And for the next weeks, the next months, the next years, he made sure that every ounce of work that the Oak King had put in was undone. He made sure where oak trees had stood, now only holly grew strong. He made sure there was not a blade of grass left. He got his buckets of snow and he went and tipped them all over the mountains. And finally, felt like it had taken him years, but finally he stood back and he looked at everything he'd done. Wasn't this moment meant to feel great? Hadn't he achieved everything that he'd ever wanted? Look at this frozen land. But there was nothing left for him to do. He'd loved going and dusting the mountains with snow, but there wasn't a mountain left that wasn't covered in snow. He'd loved taking the leaves off the tree, delighting in picking off oak leaves one by one and watching as they blew into the wind. He'd loved making sure the sun was on the horizon, but now the sun was always there. It was always cold. There was nothing left to create. But also he felt something else deeper. Inside his stomach, he felt something that he hadn't felt before. It was loneliness. And first it was small, but it began to expand and expand and expand until it took over everything. And at the same time he began to think more about his youth. He began to think more about the times he'd spent with his brother when they were younger. The plans they'd had. The good times. As he sat outside his icy palace, he began to cry, and as he did, his tears began to freeze in his face, on his cheeks. And he wished, above all wishes, that he could just see his brother, the Oak King, one more time. Now, it just so happened that shortly after he'd walked away, leaving his brother for dead, someone had come along. It was a woman who, even in the darkness, radiated. People said she was the moon. Now, she took the Oak King and she dragged him off through the snow and she took him to the place where she lived. There's a small cave inside a mountain with a fire burning in the middle. Around it she'd collected herbs and dried them out. She had potions of all kinds. She was a healer. She knew exactly what to do, and there she looked after the Oak King. She nurtured him. At first he was unconscious, bedridden, but soon he was awake. Taking his first tentative steps, she would hold him up as he tried to step across the space, across the cave. And every day he grew a little bit stronger and a little bit stronger. It was just that moment that the Holly King was sitting outside his ice palace, the tears freezing down his face. What have I done? I cannot hold this alone. It is too much for me. But this is my fate. Now, as he said that, though, he looked over and he saw something strange. He stood up and he walked closer and he looked down, and there was a patch where the ice had begun to melt, and out of it there were some new shoots of grass. He looked around and there was a few more patches like that. How could this be? He had not done this. He did not want this. Now, if he thought hard enough, if he focused on it, he could make it wilt and he could make the ice come back, but he just didn't want to do that. He was confused. How can this be? And he looked up and he could see two figures walking down at the bottom of the mountain. And they were getting closer and closer. One of them was a beautiful woman who seemed to radiate even in the darkness. And the other, as the other one took steps forward, it seemed like the sun was getting higher and higher and higher in the sky until he could see who it was. "My brother," he said, "my brother!" And he called out and he began to sprint down the mountain as quick as he could until he got before the two people. He ran straight up to his brother. He grasped him. And then he held him by the shoulders and he looked him in the eyes. He said, "I am so glad to see you. I have done terrible things and I regret them deeply." And the Oak King looked back at his brother. And he said, "I have done bad things too, and I regret them." And so they sat down together. And as they did, the ice and the green grass swayed gently back and forth between each other. And they talked. And they realised that neither of them could do this alone, that the land could not always be abundant, that the soil needed to rest, that the trees, to get the best fruits, they needed to rest too. But the land could not always be cold and icy and hostile. There needed to be a play between the two. There needed to be a dance between the two. So it was right there on that day that the Oak King and the Holly King, they sat not as enemies but as brothers. And they divided up the year. Half will be the domain of the Oak King and the other half the domain of the Holly King. And so it is at the summer solstice that the Oak King has reached his peak, that he's reached his crescendo. And while it may seem that summer is just starting, we're actually at the point where light is giving way to darkness. And the Oak King is beginning the process of handing over his reign to his brother. And at the autumn equinox, they will be equal in power, and the Oak King and the Holly King will rule. And they'll share up the land. They'll share the time, half and half, in a dance that will go on from now until the end of time. Thank you for listening to Myths in the Meadow. Thank you for listening to the story of the Oak King and the Holly King, and please do go out and share it with others. And I hope to see you back here in this meadow, either on this video or in person very soon. Ciao.